Hello, everyone. I am excited to bring you a special conversation today with Marc Lacey. He is managing editor of the New York Times. In that role, he helps oversee a newsroom of more than 2,000 journalists. It is the second highest editorial position at the newspaper, which he shares with Carolyn Ryan. Marc Lacey previously served as the national editor, a foreign correspondent in Africa and Latin America, and as a White House correspondent, and many, many other roles. He's had more than 2 decades with the newspaper, and it is a real pleasure to have him with us. Marc, thanks so much for your time today.
It's good to be with you.
I have to tell you, the New York Times has been a staple in my life literally since birth. My dad had it with him in the hospital when I entered the world. So I think you've been part of my life from day one. And I'm very excited to talk to you about the changing media landscape, trust, AI, and all the rest. But I'd really like to start with the news this week. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has announced that the DOJ and the Pentagon are forming a task force to identify and prosecute alleged, quote, leakers. And last week, the Justice Department subpoenaed 4 of your New York Times journalists. They want them to testify before a grand jury Wednesday. And it's over there reporting about possible security vulnerabilities on the Qatari gifted jet. Presumably, they want your reporters to give up their sources. Can you share a little bit about how you think about what their options are here? And are you in any kind of position to protect them if they're found in contempt or even threatened with jail?
Thanks for the question. We're spending a lot of time talking about this very issue. We think that this is a pretty brazen, unconstitutional attempt by the administration to try to chill our journalism on an issue that we have no doubt is of public interest, extreme public interest. So we think we're on very solid legal ground here. We're going to be challenging the subpoenas. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but we feel as though our reporters are on solid ground. We're going to be pushing back, fighting this, and we're confident that we're going to prevail in this as well.
You know, it's not the first time New York Times reporters have been subpoenaed. Some in the past and recent decades have even spent some time in jail. But this administration's tactics seem a little bit different, and their readiness to go after reporters seems different. Can you share a little bit about your perspective on how they're targeting leakers and journalists, how it's distinct from how prior administrations have done that, and does it change how you think about protecting your reporters?
So you're right that this is not the first time that a New York Times reporter has been subpoenaed by a administration. In fact, it happened during the Obama administration. If you go way back, I'm doing a little historical research, and during the Nixon administration, one of our reporters was subpoenaed. It was a big case, went all the way to the Supreme Court. So this is something that we're kind of practiced in having an administration pushing back against our reporting. This feels particularly brazen, though. This does feel as though it's an attempt by the administration to sort of prevent people from talking to us, from trying to get us to
Mhm.
give up confidential sources. As you know, confidential sources are an essential part of accountability journalism in Washington, particularly. So we're going to be fighting this. You know how this plays out from here. We're confident that our folks are not going to have to give up their sources, and we feel as though this. If you read the story that so riled the president about the Air Force One, the new Air Force One not having proper security measures. What's
Mhm.
pretty interesting is in the third paragraph of that story, we quote the White House communications director who. This story was of no surprise to the administration. We always go to the administration when we're running stories like this. So we think we're on solid ground here.
Can I just ask you to say the next step of that, which is, I know this from my years covering Washington myself. There are times an administration has asked you to withhold something for national security reasons, and the Times has done that and has that practice. Is that correct?
Yes, when an administration has concerns about something we are about to publish, we will get on the phone, we will go to their offices, we will have conversations, and we want to hear very specifically about the harm that would be caused by publishing. And we've had many of those conversations with high level officials over virtually every administration. And so that isn't a rare thing to have a conversation, to have an administration that is pushing back and urging us not to publish. We felt very comfortable in this case publishing the story, and we have a legal team here, a formidable legal team who reviews every story like this before it's published, and we feel really comfortable that we're on solid legal
Mhm.
ground.
I'll add for the audience that there is also a political objective sometimes when administrations do something like this, which is the chilling effect it can create, and the signal it sends to potential leakers to not talk to the press if they think that it's going to escalate to a court hearing. There's sometimes an intention there to make it just harder to report. If you want to comment on that, great. If not, I can move on.
Yeah, I totally agree that that is one of the objectives, and we're not the first organization that has been subpoenaed by this administration, and some of those have just quietly gone away, and they've made their point, and then they've quietly gone away.
So here's one that has not gone away, which is President Trump's lawsuit against the New York Times. He's suing you all for, I think it's $15 billion, just a little extra change lying around. It's a strange position you must find yourself in to have to defend the institution against a president while also covering him and his administration. I'm curious how you think about maintaining objectivity in that situation. And more broadly, how do you cover a political figure and even a movement that openly calls your organization the enemy of the people?
A really good question. I think we're practiced in this as well, sort of having politicians who are pushing back at your reporting. In the case of President Trump, calling you names, insulting you, openly deriding your news organization and individual reporters on social media. So we're sort of used to that. I mean, we have a motto here, without fear or favor. It's something that the very first publisher of the Times sort of wrote on the very first day of the modern New York Times. And what the fear part of that is we will not be um, bowed by such things. We're going to come back covering this administration just as we have before. And without fear or favor, that means we cover an administration fairly, objectively. We don't let a personal thing, and even a lawsuit against our company, even subpoenas against our reporters, we don't let that affect our coverage of the big issues of the day. So that's
Mhm.
we're kind of used to this.
Right, professional compartmentalization to some extent. Um, it is no secret that many Americans rely on the New York Times, and so do people around the globe. And then many Americans view the paper as ideologically slanted. When I told my audience that I was interviewing you and asked for their questions, I was flooded with complaints from every point of view. The Times is too soft on Trump. The Times is too obsessed with going hard on Trump. The Times is too critical of the trans community. The Times is too indulgent of the trans community. And then, of course, those people who feel that the Times is biased against Israel or biased against Palestinians. I know you live with this every day. I've heard you speak about this. Um, I think the tension seems to me to be sharpest around Gaza. So let's tease this out with one example. if I
Mhm.
may. Nicholas Kristof recently wrote about allegations that Palestinian prisoners were being raped in Israeli prisons, and in one instance, this involved rape by a dog. Joe Kahn later said that the piece likely would not have run that way on the news side. This was published again in the op-ed pages. Would you explain why not? What would have been different, and was it a mistake to publish that?
So first of all, Nick Kristof is an experienced journalist, one of our best. He works for as you noted, the opinion side of the New York Times, which is not here in the newsroom where I sit. I read his piece as you did once it was published. It did not go through the editing in the newsroom. It was, though, rigorously edited by our opinion colleagues. It's a different animal. It's a different type of journalism, but it's just as rigorous. And what Joe Kahn, the editor of the Times, said in that interview that you cited, what he said is that the we in the newsroom had written stories on some of these same allegations. And we may not have written the exact same piece that he did, but the allegations we've dug into, we continue to dig into. So I don't think we're not at all suggesting that there was anything wrong with the opinion piece. It was a great piece of opinion journalism.
Does that mean that the dog rape allegation itself is reporting the New York Times on the news side has validated?
That particular allegation, I don't believe so.
So, like in practical reality, in the world we live in, you and I understand the difference between a process on the op-ed side and a process on the news side, but most of the audience sees that and cites it as New York Times reporting. So I'm curious, given that the public doesn't quite understand or always know that distinction, does the Times bear responsibility for some of that confusion in the public? And should it change how opinion pieces are labeled or presented?
We've done a lot of work around the labeling question. There is no doubt that there's confusion out there. So it's really difficult to see if you go to our site and to read a piece that is written by the opinion side, read a piece that is written by the news side. It's really hard to miss the label that says opinion. There's a different typeface. So I think we're labeling it. We've done a whole lot about. I think there is a lot of people who are criticizing pieces of New York Times journalism. We have found are not actually reading the New York Times journalism. They're reading summaries or critiques of the New York Times journalism. And when I get criticism, and I get a whole lot, as you've cited, I often tell first of all, I'm eager to receive that, but I really want to be engaging with someone who's actually read the piece. And I think if you go to the actual piece, it says opinion. It says opinion. It says it very clearly. So I don't think there's confusion among those who are actually engaging in the pieces versus the commentary around the pieces.
I get this too. I can't tell you how many people write me and take issue with some headline, and you're like, "Did you actually read beyond that?" The
Yeah,
headline, please. Uh, there's one more twist on this, one more nuance, which is
yeah.
it is labeled an opinion piece, but in this exact example, it's really reportage. So he is a former foreign correspondent who's reporting something that you've said is validated and rigorous as reported information. Is it a different standard? Would the Times side, the news side, also report that specific instance of dog rape? Have you checked it separately through your separate channels on the news side?
We're, our correspondents in the Middle East have written on this very
On
issue
the
and
dog
are
part,
going
okay.
and are going to be writing more on this issue. So I'm not going to get into exactly what they have planned, but yeah, it's a valid issue of public interest, no doubt about it. But I'm not. An opinion piece is a different genre of journalism. It doesn't have a lower standard. It's a different genre.
But the facts are still checked and verified. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, on the other side, given the global stakes of the war, I'm curious to understand, why doesn't the Times currently have its own staff reporters inside Gaza? And if the answer is that you've tried and been restricted, have you taken legal action to try to push the Israeli government for access?
The answer, as you noted, is that we are not able to get into Gaza. We would very much like to be in Gaza. We are covering on the ground conflict zones all over the world,
Yeah.
and we would very much like to be there. We're not able to be there. We have been lobbying the Israeli government for years to get access to Gaza, and we have joined efforts with other news organizations to get in. So it's really important, and it does hamper our ability to report the dynamics there when we're not on the ground. But I have to say, for those who follow us closely, we're doing really aggressive work to capture the dynamics. And it includes telephone interviews, it includes satellite technology. We're capturing the dynamics, but it's not the same as having reporters on the ground. I totally acknowledge that.
You have sent, as you acknowledge, reporters into war zones and recently Ebola clinics. How do you decide when the risk is necessary? And with Gaza in particular, without independent access, how confident can the Times be in its own reporting about Gaza?
I think we can. I think we're very confident in what we're reporting, but we realize that it is only part of the story, and we're not able to see everything with our own eyes. As for sending people in, we can't. I can't sort of order someone into a war zone, um, but we have on our staff all sorts of reporters who want nothing more than to be in the middle of a big story, like Ebola, like Ukraine, and like Gaza. They're clamoring to go. This is what they do. It's their life's work, and they would love to be there to report back on what they're seeing.
You can't just sneak them in through the Rafah gate.
Can't. We
Okay.
cannot. I mean, one thing that's really important, and you touched on this, is security. We have to be sure we have a big security team, and we have to be sure that all of our reporters are safe. And you mentioned Ebola. We had a correspondent, a team of video journalists, and if you watch the videos that they produced, I mean, they're in the full moon suits. They're in Ebola clinics, and they are clearly in harm's way. And they're talking to people who have Ebola and some people who passed away after the interviews. We have people in Ukraine. I visited them not too long ago, who are, being awoken at night by drones and air raid sirens. It's really the correspondents of the New York Times are out there sort of on the edge doing some pretty heroic things.
Absolutely. And sometimes I watch, especially that Ebola one, through my fingers, like, oh God, this person,
Absolutely,
they're so brave to do this.
absolutely.
And you're saying that Gaza is just that much more dangerous than all the other
It
instances you've
it's
cited.
oh, it's certainly up there, and you know this, that uh, Gaza, a large number of journalists have lost their
Yes.
lives in
Yeah.
Gaza, and they're Gazan journalists, and it's one of the most dangerous places in the world to report.
Yeah. Uh, let's turn now to journalism, trust, technology, AI, and the future of media. Small topics. One of the questions, or the number one question I get all day, especially online, is this true? But that has been morphing into people forwarding me content and saying, is this real or is this AI? I get it all day.
Yeah.
And you and I both know that truly the only way to be certain if something is AI or not is through reporting, to actually send a person to that site to see it with their own eyes or interview somebody who was there. Nothing replaces the value of having a journalist look themselves. The problem with that is that work can be dangerous, but it's also very expensive. And as we're moving into this era of AI and chat, where audiences are increasingly getting their information by going to an LLM's chatbot, um, they may stop clicking through to the source of the information they're getting. You know, some of those chats provide a link to NewYorkTimes.com, but it's not certain audiences will always go there in the end. What is your plan to avoid that? And I'm curious, I'm not looking for the mission statement version of why journalism is really valuable in the age of AI, but actually, is there a strategy to make sure audiences continue to go to the paper and not just the LLM?
Yeah, I think that's a big, big,
I know.
weighty topic, yeah, but really an important one. I think it's sort of the issue of our time. I think I remember. I mean, I've been a journalist so long that I do remember when people were saying similar things about the internet. That
Mhm.
there's all this stuff out there that isn't true. They've said the same thing about social media. I think AI is all of those concerns sort of turned up to the max because you
Yeah.
can be fooled. You can hear someone's voice, you can see their likeness, and it's just not true. I do believe that established brands, trusted sources like the New York Times are going to people are going to gravitate to us when there's all this slop out there that they're not sure if it's true. And I think you just have to be burned once or twice by thinking something is true and it's not. To
Mhm.
sort of realize you want, I mean, what we pride ourselves on, and I don't, this is not an advertisement, I think it's really true, is having um, expert journalists being on the ground, figuring things out, actually seeing things through our own eyes, and that will not be able to be replaced by AI. AI cannot go to Ukraine. AI cannot do that. It can summarize perhaps what we're writing, but it can't go to an Ebola clinic. It just can't do that. And so I'm not worried about that form of journalism that is really rooting out what's going on in the world, and that sort of eyewitness bearing witness journalism. We're always going to need that.
I'm curious. I know that one of the things that Times is doing is making this push into video
Yeah.
now, where more and more of your reporters are on camera themselves on the website and the app, et cetera. Um, I will say that in the 2010s, when I was still at CNN, I went to meet with the leadership at the New York Times to pitch them on creating video for journalists at the New York Times because had audiences are going to expect it. And that never went anywhere. So I did this, but I'm very glad to see that you're doing it now. I'm curious, is the thinking behind that part of creating sort of reminding audiences of that unique value that you say the Times brings, and also developing a personal relationship between audience and the reporters so they feel that kind of more personal connection so they do keep coming back instead of going to the chatbot?
I think everything you said right there is absolutely true. We had some years back, we learned this really surprising thing when we were doing reader surveys, sort of interviewing New York Times readers, that they did not understand what a dateline meant. So
Mm.
it was during the time when we were in Iraq, and there were a lot of stories that said Baghdad in all caps before the story began, and people did not know that that
Why?
meant that the journalist was there on the ground. And we, as New York Times journalists, those of us who have been around for a long time, actually learned not to put yourself in the story and to write
Yes.
the story a little abstractly. And we want people to know that we're there. And the Ebola story, that stories that you're citing, like you can read the stories and the stories were chilling, but the video and seeing the team in the ward just adds so much more. We have really, really smart journalists who are sort of experts in their field, and we're proud to sort of show them off. And so it is what you're saying. It's sort of showing our work, showing how journalism is
Mhm.
done, but also introducing people to the journalists themselves.
Substack, independent journalists, podcast journalists, they're all creating some competition to the extent you consider it that. I'm
Yeah,
curious if you
yeah,
do for the Times. And part of the reason we connect is because there's a more personal bond with the audience. We reveal a little bit about our personalities or our lives or ourselves in a way that Times reporters just it's not it's not your brand. It's not how you all do things. Um, if audiences of the future expect that kind of personal connection, how do you think about the Times earning and then keeping the trust of younger audiences who are raised to want that from their reporters, who want that personal bond?
yeah. I speak at a lot of college campuses whenever I travel the country. I enjoy talking to students. One, they don't really know what a managing editor does, but one thing they always ask me is, "Do you know Michael Barbaro?"
Right.
The host of
The
the
Daily.
Daily, and it's amazing to me how that podcast is extremely popular on college campuses. And it's not, it is what you're talking about. It's conversational. It's around centered on one great journalist, one great host, and now it's expanded to three hosts. So the Daily is definitely doing that. But I think these videos are expanding our reach, and I have great hope that there's ways for us to get New York Times journalism, the rigor of it, the fact that we're on the ground, out into um, out into areas where a younger generation is consuming the news, and they're not doing it in the newspaper. The newspaper. I mean, I talk to young people who say everything in there is old. It gets your fingers dirty. The newspaper is not how young people are getting their news, and we get that.
So you might let journalists show a little leg, by which I mean a little personality
I think if you watch our videos, you're getting that.
more.
There's actually some humor. You'll actually
Sure.
laugh every once in a while at some of our journalists. Like you're gonna see Vanessa Friedman, our fashion critic, actually covering a runway show and learn what that's like. It's like you're out with, it's not all doom and gloom. It's not all
Right.
serious stuff. There's a lot of things that the New York Times covers that we're proud of.
You're out in the field with them if you watch these videos. So I want to ask you at least one audience question before I let you go,
Please.
because and one person wrote me in, I thought this is interesting. And they asked, "Do you actively seek to prevent bias, conscious or otherwise? And if so, how would you know if you're succeeding or failing?"
It's a really good question. I think readers might think that we're cavalierly making decisions about headlines and what to write and what we're publishing. We have many, many layers of editors who review things. We have spirited debates over how to cover things. Journalism has to go through that process of what about this? What about that? We're trained that way to ask questions and push back. And so for a piece of journalism to emerge from all of the journalists who are picking it apart, it has rigor. But here's the other thing that you touched on, all the criticism early
Mhm.
on in our chat, and I think it's really important. We do hear from people on all sides of issues. They're criticizing us for being too this or too that. We have to listen to our critics, and we have to be humble. We have to correct things when we get them wrong. And I'm proud to work for a news organization that does correct things. I mean, we take
It's true.
that very seriously. There's a whole team, that's their job. We get it wrong, you'll see a correction, a big correction, a small correction. You'll see it there. So I think, how do we get at bias? We sort of have a process of interrogating the journalism, and it's not sailing through our system at all.
Mhm. I'd love to ask you one last question for the journalism world, which
Please.
is the New York Times is obviously one of the major papers still thriving in a environment in which a lot of news is collapsing, especially local news. Uh, After shuttering local news bureaus for quite some time, the Times just launched a new local newsletter in the Minnesota area, if I'm correct. Is local news coming back?
Local news is really, really important. I mean, I came up in local news. I don't know if you did as well. I worked for a weekly, I worked for the Buffalo News. I worked, most of the people in this newsroom came up in small places. Um,
Tampa
it- Tampa, yeah, it's
and
really
Orlando. Yeah.
so it's really, really important. New York Times reporters get their stories sometimes from looking through local papers and finding a nugget that they see as a bigger issue. So it's really, really important. We do have an experiment in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, that we're launching in the next couple months. That is for sort of a first step as to whether the New York Times can do local. But we also, we're in states all across the country. We just expanded in California, in Texas. We believe that, the New York Times has New York in its title, but we're very much national, and we want people all over the country to come to us and sort of see their issues, their state, and in some cases, their local issues reflected on our pages, or even pages is an outdated form.
Yeah.
But really, we have big ambitions to be read by everyone everywhere, and local, I think, is part of that.
Great. Well, Mark, I am grateful for your time today, especially given all the news taking place, and for your work every day and for 20 plus years keeping us informed. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jessica.
Everyone, thanks for your time today. And we'll post this across platforms so you can watch and share. I'll see you soon.